So let's get right into part 3, the George H.W. Bush years. This starts in 1992 and goes all the way through 2001 when we get into the William J. Clinton years, which is a whole different chapter all within itself. But it's really important to understand that, especially in current events, and especially with what's going on today with these, the NWO marches, they are upholding the same New World Order agenda that we're discussing here in this book. So it does ring true with current events, but if we don't know about our ails of history, I guess you could say, our faults in history and our shortcomings, then we are most certainly doomed to repeat them. So without further ado, let's get into part 3, the insiders, architects of the New World Order. And this is the George H.W. Bush years. The grip on the reins of the U.S. government possessed by the insiders grew dramatically when George Bush entered the White House. Far from being an opponent of the powerful few who dictate America's policies, Mr. Bush is a long-standing member of the insider clique, sometimes known simply as the establishment. Now, do you guys know another synonym for clique? It's a cabal. It's a group of like-minded individuals who keep their doings secret, and that is exactly what the insiders do. The Council on Foreign Relations has a strict hush-hush policy, and if you're caught talking about what goes on inside the meetings, you're out. That's just all there is to it. So that's the cabal of the CFR. And the establishment, remember, that is another term for what is currently going on also inside of our government. And our current president calls it the swamp, but it's really one and the same. Staff reporter Sidney Blumenthal could write in the February 10th, 1988 issue of the insider-led Washington Post, George Bush, in fact, has been a dues-paying member of the establishment, if it is succinctly defined as the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. In his article, Mr. Blumenthal noted that Mr. Bush severed his formal ties with both organizations in 1979. But the Post reporter sought comments about Mr. Bush's twin resignations from David Rockefeller, the powerful insider who had been the chairman of both organizations when the future president began his quest for the White House. Mr. Rockefeller told Mr. Blumenthal in 1988, "Bush has the knowledge and has the background and has had the posts. If he were president, he would be in a better position than anyone else to pull together the people in the country who believe that we are in fact living in one world and have to act that way. I don't know what I would have done about certain criticism for holding memberships in both the CFR and the TC. I don't think he really accomplished what he had hoped. It was still used against him, and he has since spoken to the Council and the Trilateral and has fully been supportive of their activities. Even though he has resigned, he hasn't walked away from them." Clearly, George Bush may have resigned formal memberships of the CFR and the TC in 1979, but his heart was still with both organizations. On March 29, 1981, only 9 weeks after he took the oath of office for vice president, he addressed a Trilateral Commission meeting held in Washington. The next day was to have been the occasion of a meeting of trilateral officials with President Reagan in the Oval Office, but it had to be canceled because of John Hinckley's attempt on the president's life that very morning. Early in the 1980 campaign, Mr. Bush distributed a statement about his affiliation with the Trilateral Commission. Given on George Bush for President stationery, it said, "I personally severed my association with the Trilateral Commission as well as with many other groups I have been involved with because I didn't have time to attend the endless conferences." Once an elected vice president, however, he managed to find enough time even to deliver a speech at one of those endless trilateral conferences. The Bush path to the White House. There wasn't much doubt that George Bush would receive the Republican nomination for president in 1988. For 8 years, he had dutifully followed the lead set by President Ronald Reagan and all of the other CFR appointees dominating the administration. How many CFR members were part of the Reagan-Bush team? CFR annual reports for 1981 and 1988 show that in the early months of the Reagan presidency, 257 CFR members had posts in the U.S. government office as officials, and by mid-1988, however, the number had risen to 313. Ronald Reagan was ultimately responsible for the growing CFR dominance, but George Bush was surely not complaining about it. As vice presidents are expected to do, Mr. Bush stayed out of the limelight. He spent those years representing the United States at scores of foreign funerals, making appearances at Republican fundraising events, and sitting behind Mr. Reagan in full view of the television cameras during each of the State of the Union addresses, and nodding in approval at whatever the president was saying or doing. It wasn't difficult for him because even though Mr. Reagan had at times uttered some conservative-sounding sentiments and seemed like an opponent of the insider establishment, the president's actions were very much in keeping with the agenda of the insiders. The Reagan performance rarely matched the Reagan rhetoric, and it continuously indicated that the president didn't really mean what he was saying. Good Republican soldier George Bush was even willing to suppress his stinging characterization of candidate Reagan's 1980 economics plan as, quote, voodoo economics. The Reagan program called for increased defense spending and decreased taxation, all of which the former California governor claimed could be accomplished while still producing a balanced budget. Spend more, take in less, and balance the budget? While George Bush was still contesting for the 1980 Republican nomination, he went on the attack, and his choice of words voodoo to describe the Reagan plan was both reasonable and colorful. When the economic reality dawned, in other words, the $110 billion deficit for fiscal 1982, the first full year of Reagan administration, it was the highest in U.S. history. One wag suggested that Reaganomics was giving voodoo a bad name. But as a stalwart insider, even more than a member of the Reagan team, George Bush dutifully bit his tongue and supported the piling up of huge deficits for the next generation to shoulder, even as they grew larger and more threatening. How bad did it get? Well, the average annual deficit for the 8 years of the Reagan administration exceeded $175 billion. That's for each year. If the vaunted Reagan Revolution had promised anything, it had promised fiscal responsibility. Yet the insiders whom Mr. Reagan placed in charge gave the nation exactly the opposite. The fiscal profligacy was there for anyone to see. When the Republicans took office in January of 1981, the accumulated national debt amassed over the 200-year history of the United States stood at $935 billion. That's it. For 200 years, it was $935 billion. That was our fiscal debt. Then, on September 30th, 1988, 4 months before the end of Reagan presidency and the end of his last full fiscal year of the Reagan era, the debt had just about tripled and stood at $2,572 billion. During those 8 years, the United States went from being the world's largest creditor nation to becoming its largest debtor. No more could we scoff at Mexico, Argentina, or Brazil. We were in way worse shape. The future of the American people and their nation was being mortgaged by the insiders running the Reagan-Bush team, but George Bush's political future dictated that he kept quiet about it. And the insider-dominated media, which should have repeatedly reminded him of his voodoo remark, ignored the plunge into debt and gave the impression that there wasn't anything anyone could do or should do about it. Why this conspiracy of silence? Because deficits leading to socialist control of the American people were exactly what the insiders wanted. Because no one knew this better than the vice president, whose ties to the insiders were both numerous and unbroken, and because the media itself was insider-dominated. The loaded resume. There has never been a presidential candidate who could produce a more impressive and a more insider-connected resume than the one George Bush offered in 1988. He had served virtually everywhere. Other than his 2 terms as a Republican congressman from Houston, however, he'd been appointed by insiders to every position he had. With connections orchestrated early in his career by his father, Prescott Bush, a Wall Street international banker insider who served as a liberal Republican senator from Connecticut during 1950, George had access to many of the quote-unquote right people. And he had other early connections too, such as a membership in the very prestigious yet downright spooky Skull and Bones Society at Yale. According to a 1977 article in Esquire magazine, the little-known society forces its members to participate in arcane rituals, maintain deep secrecy, and swear unswerving loyalty to the organization itself. Each year at Yale, 15 seniors are welcomed into this group. The Skull and Bones roster lists some extremely prominent and influential Americans, many of whom are distinguished for having been lifelong internationalists. There include W. Avril Harriman, Henry Stimson, Henry Luce, McGeorge Bundy, William Bundy, Winston Lord, and Robert Lovett. Questions to members about what goes on within the Skull and Bones always go unanswered, inviting the charge that something is indeed being hidden. The late Gary Allen believed the group to be a recruiting ground for the international banking clique, the CIA, and politics. It is hardly surprising that Mr. Bush chose Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart to administer his oath of office as president in January 1981. A 1937 graduate of Yale, Justice Stewart was himself a Skull and Bones member. A presidential candidate's membership in a secret society such as Skull and Bones ought to evoke numerous questions from the mass media and the public. But because the group is so little known, there is virtually no controversy about it or about the president's affiliation with it. In 1970, George Bush was soundly defeated in his bid for a U.S. Senate seat from Texas. Council on Foreign Relations veteran Richard Nixon rescued him from potential obscurity by naming him U.S. Ambassador to the United States. The new appointee began his duties by recommending the seat of Red China alongside Nationalist China. When the UN voted to seat only the Communist Chinese and their delegate used his maiden speech to condemn the United States, Mr. Bush expressed mere disappointment. A better man would have walked out on that nest of anti-American tyrants, which is exactly the response Mr. Bush once advocated. In 1964, he declared, if Red China should be admitted to the UN, then the UN is hopeless and we should withdraw. Rhetoric is one thing, and as this statement and what followed surely proves, performance is frequently quite the opposite. What is also true is that a better person than the man sitting in the UN post would never have accepted appointment to it in the first place. How seriously our nation was hated at the UN could only be gauged by the spectacle of delegates actually dancing in the aisles when the General Assembly ousted Free China, gave China's seat to the communist regime, and delivered an international insult to the United States. Ambassador Bush responded meekly and then proceeded to welcome the emissary of the Peking tyranny to the Security Council seat from which the anti-communist Chinese had just been expelled. He then found no difficulty supporting Mr. Nixon's growing friendship with Peking's murderous tyrants, and he helped to make their groveling 1972 Nixon pilgrimage to the land of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai a much-needed source of legitimacy for the Red Chinese regime. During that highly publicized visit, President Nixon's formal banquet toast to Chairman Mao and Premier Chao included his revealing assurance that their history-making meeting was taking place because of, quote, the hope that each of us has to build a new world order, end quote. And there's emphasis added on new world order. The use of the phrase was unsettling to Americans who knew that insiders had been employing it for generations, but it didn't upset George Bush, and claims in 1991 by the White House that Mr. Bush and National Security Advisor Socroft had dreamed it up themselves during a boat ride off Kennebunkport in August of 1990 were bold-faced lies. After Red China had been completely accepted at the United Nations, and after the future president had spent a considerable amount of his time trying to repair the UN's sagging reputation with the American people, George Bush abandoned the UN post in early 1973 to accept election as national chairman of the Republican Party. This was essentially another appointment, even though party regulars went through the formality of electing him. Almost immediately, he found himself embroiled in the Watergate travel of his good friend Richard Nixon. He managed to survive that curious episode in American history, although Nixon did not. Then, given his choice of posts by President Gerald Ford, whose administration was in the hands of such highly placed insiders as Henry Kissinger, Mr. Bush opted in October of 1974 to lead the U.S. liaison office in Peking. The Senate Internal Security Subcommittee's 1971 report, entitled Human Cost of Communism in China, had detailed the systematic liquidation of tens of millions of Chinese by the forces controlled by Mao and Chao. Mass murder and other forms of inhuman treatment of the Chinese and Tibetan peoples were still going on, but none of that deterred Mr. Bush from doing what he could to provide the murderers with much-needed legitimacy. It was insider policy to bring mainland China into the community of nations. President Ford then enabled Mr. Bush to add another item to his resume by appointing him director of the Central Intelligence Agency in December of 1975. He lasted only a year at CIA because his newest patron, Gerald Ford, lost to Jimmy Carter in the 1976 presidential race. The final entry in the Bush resume, of course, focused on his 8 years as vice president under Ronald Reagan. All in all, a stunningly impressive listing of credentials: 2 terms in Congress, ambassador to the UN, chairman of the Republican Party, chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in Peking, CIA director, and vice president of the United States. These were his open credentials, the ones George Bush wanted everyone to be aware of. Insider credentials. But George Bush had other credentials that he kept quiet. Although he wanted them known within insider circles, he had accepted membership in the Council on Foreign Relations during 1971 and a place on the roster of the Trilateral Commission during 1977. As all members of these elite groups always do, he avoided publicity about his insider connections because a growing number of Americans had learned about CFR and TC goals and didn't want what each advocated. Unlike the CFR that delights in listing its important members, the Trilateral Commission had a policy of denying or suspending membership to holders of national government posts. The group periodically publishes a list naming former members in public service, along with its fewer than 300 members, a third from North America and Europe and Japan, respectively. As soon as their government service is completed, however, these individuals are frequently welcomed back into the organization. And see, that's what I have a problem with, you guys. I think that these two should be mutually exclusive, and if you are a member of the Trilateral Commission or the Council on Foreign Relations, you should not be allowed to serve in the American government because you do not have the American Constitution or the American people's rights at your best interest or at heart. So moving forward, as soon as the government service is completed, however, these individuals are frequently welcomed back into the organization. He had not been serving in the government posts. Mr. Bush would likely have been tapped for trilateral membership earlier than 1977. The commission formed in 1973 by CFR leaders David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski to promote world government, who made to order for an ambitious implementer of insider objectives. So basically, the same two people that formed Jimmy Carter for his presidency are the same ones that formed these commissions. Out of the government service early in 1977, Mr. Bush immediately signed on with the Trilateral elite and also accepted a post on the 25-member board of directors of the CFR. Over the years, many CFR members have sought to defend their own participation in the world government promoting group by insisting that they were trying to bring a more patriotic perspective into the group's proceedings. Yeah, right. It is safe to say, however, that no one trying to challenge the overall thrust of the CFR ended up on its board of directors. So, of course, they're not going to let you serve on the board if you don't have their best interest and their nefarious agenda at heart. With duties surrounding his board of directors' service in the CFR and his new membership in the TC, the twin pillars of the establishment both led by David Rockefeller, Mr. Bush kept very busy. He also began spending time in Houston, where he teamed up with James Baker III, the man who made a name for himself during the 1976 Republican sweepstakes, both with his strong support for establishment favorite Gerald Ford and his equally strong distaste for Ronald Reagan's conservative pronouncements. The two began planning for a 1980 Bush run at the White House. Atlantic Council. Another credential Mr. Bush didn't publicize was his mid-1970s membership of the Board of Directors of the Atlantic Council of the United States, or AC. Formed in the 1960s by former Secretary of State Christian Herter, the AC's formal policy statement, approved on May 10, 1976, was endorsed by George Bush when he became an AC board member in 1978. It claims that the changing world, quote, can no longer be accommodated by political forms and sovereignties developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, end quote. What this means, of course, is that in the view of the Atlantic Council's planners, the independent United States of America, formed in the 18th century, is an anachronism. The AC policy statement boldly enunciated a desire to form institutions, quote, to deal adequately with problems with which no existing nation-state can cope successfully alone. In other words, let's do away with nation-states like the United States. Other members of the Atlantic Council Board who serve alongside George Bush include such prominent insider CFR stalwarts as Henry Kissinger, Paul Nitz, William J. Casey, Brent Scowcroft, Harlan Cleveland, and Eugene Rostow. The organization's publication Issues and Opinions also noted that its board of directors included George S. Franklin Jr., coordinator of the Trilateral Commission, and Winston Lord, president, Council of the Foreign Relations. Interlocking memberships and directorates in these insider organizations have always been common. Insider enthusiasm for one of their own to occupy the president's office has also been just as common. An insider in the White House. As president, Mr. Bush dutifully awarded the following key posts to insiders of the CFR. Secretary of Defense went to Dick Cheney, and like Mr. Bush, Cheney had been a CFR board member. Secretary of the Treasury was given to Nicholas Brady, National Security Advisor to Brent Scowcroft, another CFR board member. Attorney General to Richard Thornsberg, CIA Director to William Webster, Deputy Secretary of State to Lawrence Eagleburger, Office of Management of Budget Director to Richard Darman, Federal Reserve Chairman to Alan Greenspan, and Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman to General Colin Powell. As of February 4th, 1991, the Trilateral Commission, hardly a disqualifying credential for service on the Bush team, could proudly list as former members in public service George Bush, Richard Darman, Lawrence Eagleburger, Alan Greenspan, and Brent Scowcroft. So all five of those had been previously on the roster of the Trilateral Commission. The absence of Secretary of State James A. Baker III's name from the CFR roster breaks the string of 10 Secretaries of State in a row, starting with Dean Acheson in the Truman administration, who held memberships in the organization. Why Baker has never been appointed or why he has declined an invitation if one were offered is unknown. He is ideologically on time with everything the CFR wants for America and has himself chosen CFR members at the top of his advisors. The Baker-led State Department shocked even its most intense critics in late April 1990 with the invitation to Tim Wheeler to be the featured speaker at a May Day luncheon in the department's plush reception rooms. At that time, Wheeler was the veteran Washington correspondent for the People's Daily World, the official newspaper of the Communist Party USA. With CFR members dominating state, this invitation is not too surprising. It calls to mind a revealing comment about Anatoly Dobrynin, Soviet Russia's valued ambassador to the U.S. from 1962 to 1986. A very suave spokesperson for his tyrannical government, this ex officio head of the KGB in the United States has actually befriended many American leaders during his long stay in Washington. Writing about him in the May 13, 1984 New York Times magazine, Madeline G. Kolb noted his distaste for speeches and interviews, but revealed that he had always kept in touch with influential journalists and top people at such organizations as the Council on Foreign Relations. Communist officials always found CFR leaders far more compatible than any anti-communist American. According to the CFR's 1991 annual report, a whopping 382 of its members were serving as U.S. government officials. The organization's total membership numbered only 2,750, meaning that 14% of those who had joined this leading insider group hold high government positions. No other remotely similar organization can claim such clout within the government. This startling dominance over the nation's affairs ought to be a burning issue, but CFR dominance of the mass media keeps most Americans totally unaware of who is really running the U.S. government. The insiders, of course, hope to keep us unaware. The New World Order. In keeping with his insider credentials, President Bush grabbed at an opportunity to advance the insider agenda. He reacted to the August 2nd, 1990 Iraqi attack on Kuwait by immediately sending U.S. military forces to the Middle East. He furiously gathered support from a coalition-backed effort to confront Saddam Hussein. He went to the United Nations, where he supported economic sanctions against Iraq, even as he was stepping up his own anti-Hussein rhetoric and sending increasing numbers of U.S. troops into the region. He turned to the United Nations, not the U.S. Constitution, to which he'd sworn a solemn oath, for authorization for his military moves. He then began to state his goals over and over again. September 11th, 1990, televised address, Mr. Bush states, "Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge. We are now in sight of a United Nations that performs as envisioned by its founders." Again, on January 7th, 1991, in an interview in U.S. News and World Report, he states, "I think that what's at stake here is the New World Order. What's at stake here is whether we can have disputes peacefully resolved in the future by a reinvigorated United Nations." And again, on January 9th, 1991, 2 days later, at a press conference, he states, "The Gulf crisis has to do with a new world order, and that new world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations proves to be effective." January 16th, 1991, in a televised address, he states, "When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders." And again, those are Marxists. They're communists. August 1991, at the National Security Strategy of the United States, issued by the White House and personally signed by George Bush, he states, "In the Gulf, we saw the United Nations playing the role dreamed of by its founders. I hope history will record that the Gulf crisis was the crucible of the New World Order." So two common themes are present in each of these pronouncements. One, the president is clearly committed to the New World Order, and two, his view of the New World Order includes boosting the prestige and the power of the United Nations. What he didn't explain is that the phrase New World Order has been used for generations by individuals seeking to control the world. Those employing it have sought socialism, which is economic control, and world government, which is political control over all mankind. The war for a reinvigorated UN. Mr. Bush's revealing statements called for a United Nations as envisioned by its founders. It becomes critically important, therefore, to know who these founders were. A leading member of the U.S. delegation at the founding UN conference in 1945 was Alger Hiss, later shown to have been a secret communist. There were 15 other U.S. government officials working for the establishment of the UN who were also later discovered to have been secret communists. One of them, perhaps one of the most important, was the Assistant Secretary of Treasury Harry Dexter White. He was the architect of the International Monetary Fund, to which Mr. Bush advocated giving huge amounts of U.S. taxpayers' money. Added to the list of communists busily working to create the UN were 43 current or future CFR members. Men of prominence in this group included CFR founder House's protege, John Foster Dulles, also Nelson A. Rockefeller, Adlai E. Stevenson, Edward R. Stettinice, Ralph Bunche, Philip C. Jessup, and future CFR chairman John J. McCloy. There was, of course, a delegation from the USSR. It was led by Andrei Gromyko, who, along with all of his Soviet colleagues, was a communist. Other delegations from the total of 50 nations participating in the founding were the top-heavy socialists, communists, and internationalists, one-worlders, and despisers of national sovereignty. There were also a few starry-eyed dreamers who believed that they were participating in the founding of a totally benign peacemaking organization, not something designed by its many founders as an organization meant to take control of the world. The real vision of the UN founders should hardly be a mystery to anyone. All communists who have ever walked the earth have sought world government, an end to national sovereignty, the end of personal freedom, and the domination of many by the few. And every socialist has always sought government control of everyone economically, a tactic that leads more subtly to the same goals sought by communists. The UN was literally made to order for totalitarianism, which is exactly why those who seek political or economic domination worked so hard to bring the organization into being. Also, wouldn't it be quite ridiculous to suggest that the likes of Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Andre Gromyko, John Foster Dulles, and John J. McCloy were duped into supporting an organization that would thwart their one-world designs? These men are prime examples of those who envisioned a world run by the UN that they would control. These UN founders, including the top insiders of their day, wanted the US in the world body, and they knew that the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution would have to be scrapped along the way. Therefore, Mr. Bush's determination to use the Gulf War to see the United Nations reinvigorated, according to the wishes of his founders, is both revealing and frightening. His hope that the war would be the crucible of the New World Order says it all. Liberal Senator Paul Simon, a Democrat from Illinois, addressed his Senate colleagues on January 10, 1991, a few days before President Bush gave the go-ahead to unleash the U.S. military. With war of virtual certainty, he criticized the president for giving up the sanctions option. He said his concern was shared by others, including Senator George Mitchell, who had earlier the same day given his opinion that the decision for war was being made prematurely. The two senators had toured the Middle East and even visited U.S. bases only 3 weeks earlier. Hoping to influence the president to stick with sanctions and avoid bloodshed, Simon and Mitchell had gone immediately to the White House upon returning from their December trip and were dismayed to find Mr. Bush eager for war. Simon reported that during their conversation, the president spelled out his reasons for the course he intended to pursue as follows. Quote, "If we use the military, we can make the United Nations a really meaningful, effective voice for peace and stability in the future." End quote. According to the president himself, therefore, his overriding objective is sending 500,000 U.S. troops into combat was to build the clout of the United Nations. How many of the men and women wearing the uniform of this nation understood that they were sent into battle for this reason? How many understand today? Even before he formally opposed Mr. Bush for the Republican nomination for president, journalist Patrick Buchanan said what many Americans had been longing to hear from the presidential candidate. Attacking the president's policies only weeks after the campaign against Saddam Hussein had begun, he wrote, "The trilateralist CFR, Wall Street, big business elite, the neoconservative intellectuals who dominate the think tanks and op-ed pages, the old left with its one world collective security, UN über alles dream, all have come together behind the New World Order. Everyone is on board, or so it seems, but out there trying to break through is the old, authentic voice of American patriotism, of nationalism, of America first, saying, hell no, we won't go." End quote. He was clearly challenging both the insiders' goals and their favored president, who was busily promoting their cause, and he refused to back down in the face of angry and vicious attacks. On December 10, 1991, in his New Hampshire speech announcing his candidacy for nomination, Buchanan said of the president, quote, "He is a globalist and we are nationalists. He believes in some Pax Universalis and we believe in the old republic. He would put America's wealth and power at the service of some vague new world order, and we will put America first." End quote. Dragging America down. One of the more sinister tactics employed by the socialists is to gain economic control of the people. It involves accumulating huge national indebtedness. Paying interest on the debt then gives the government leaders the excuse to impose more and more taxation. Another well-used tactic involves inviting or forcing massive numbers of citizens onto welfare rolls where they later become dependent upon government. And still another calls for burdening the productive sector with the costly, unnecessary, and downright production-inhibiting regulations. The Bush administration is guilty of all of these socialism-building tactics, even as the president dramatically boosts the world government prospects of the United Nations. Immediately after taking office in January of 1989, President Bush unveiled a federal budget containing economic forecasts, as required by law, for several years into the future. On that occasion, the president's projections included $1,249 billion in spending for fiscal 1992, with a sharp decline in the deficit to $30.6 billion. His forecast for fiscal 1993 estimated spending at $1,284 billion, with a surplus of $2.5 billion. 3 years later, in January 1992, the same president was forced to admit that the deficit for fiscal year 1992, ending September 30th, 1992, would top out at an estimated $399 billion, missing his earlier forecast by an astounding $368 billion. The deficit alone now exceeds the total federal budget during the height of the Vietnam War. He also announced that the 1991 fiscal year had been completed with a deficit of $267 billion. In addition, his January 92 forecast included a spending level of $1,520 billion for fiscal 1993, up $236 billion from his 1989 projection, with a projected deficit of $352 billion instead of the modest surplus. Most Americans remember the famous pledge given by candidate Bush in 1988. "Read my lips, no new taxes," was the catchiest campaign slogan the nation had heard in many years. Yet in October of 1990, the president signed one of the largest tax increases in American history, $164 billion over 5 years. It was another body blow delivered to the nation's producers. If any economic tinkering can help the nation out of a recession, it certainly isn't a tax increase. Yet, in the midst of the most severe economic slowdown since the Great Depression, the president cooperated in making it even worse by supporting the huge tax increase. A freshman economics student would tell you that you don't gobble up more consumer money with taxes when consumer spending is needed to spur economic recovery. But Mr. Bush helped the insider cause with the harm done to economic vitality. President proposes aid for Russia. Boris Yeltsin is currently the fair-haired hero of America's insiders. Welcomed to New York City by David Rockefeller in September 1989, he was brought to CFR headquarters for a closed-door session presided over by the powerful former CFR chairman. As one indication of insider clout, the Russian leader went first to CFR headquarters and then to Washington to meet with President Bush. Eventually talking to reporters, Yeltsin lamented that only one of the 5 classical components of socialism has been implemented, the nationalization of property. Yeltsin says he doesn't want a totally state-controlled economy, just 85 to 95% control. Let the people own 10 to 15%, he argues. Like his predecessor, Mikhail Gorbachev, he is a socialist through and through. The struggle for leadership in Russia between Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin had been won, at least temporarily, by Yeltsin, but the fight between these two had always been like the insider talk all struggles between George Bush and Michael Dukakis, or between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, or Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, or Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson, all CFR or Trilateral Commission or members of both. Each of these U.S. politicians willingly cooperated with the insiders whose organization they were happy to join. So, too, do Gorbachev and Yeltsin cooperate with the same insiders. Something else about the leaders of Russia needs to be said here. Both Gorbachev and Yeltsin are among the many former communists who share enormous guilt for the murder, terror, and denial of basic human rights for millions in the former USSR and its captive nations. Both should be held accountable for their part in those crimes and for the slaughter of 1.4 million Afghan civilians during the 1980s. As members of the USSR's ruling Politburo during the incredibly cruel rape of Afghanistan, they are and should be classified arch-criminals, and if they are not, there is no such thing as an arch-criminal. But President Bush, backed by the insiders in government, the media, and elsewhere, is doing everything within his power to sustain such monsters in power. Promises of direct U.S. aid have been kept, commitments for more in the future have been given, and pledges of indirect aid from the International Monetary Fund have also been made. Early in 1992, Mr. Bush asked Congress to boost the U.S. commitment to the IMF by $12 billion so that this organization could assist the socialists in Russia. He did so even while informing the nation that the U.S. government would, in the same year, add $400 billion more to its red ink totals. Stopping the insiders is a must. In the CFR's annual report for 1989, Peter Tarnoff, the organization's president, announced plans to create a larger office for the CFR in the nation's capital. Once built, he explained, the organization will be better able to grow in Washington and to attract many more Senate and House members and their staffs to our programs. CFR intentions to increase insider influence over our nation's government were clearly enunciated. On April 10, 1990, the Wall Street Journal published a small excerpt from a speech given by veteran CFR member Paul H. Nitz. The occasion for his remarks was the March 12th opening of the new Council of Foreign Relations office in Washington. Nitz described the great influence held by the enormously important New York business and intellectual community, referring, of course, to CFR members who continue to reside in the New York area. But while noting that Washington's importance within the CFR had grown dramatically, Nitz stated quite clearly exactly how the CFR had dominated U.S. policy from New York for 70 years. Beginning with a description of the Council's influence during the period of the 1920s and 1930s, he said, "The State Department and White House might conduct diplomacy in peace and raise and command armies in war, but policy was made by serious people, men with a longer view, i.e., the great men of finance and their advisors. New York was where they were to be found." Then, the veteran insider from within the CFR, who had served in numerous administrations, added, "In the post-war years, the Council has continued to represent an invaluable way for many of us Washingtonians to tap the enormously important New York business and intellectual community." In other words, national policy was set and continues to be set in New York, not by the elected leaders of this nation, but by members of the Council. Over these years, national policy has included financing tyranny and destroying liberty all over the globe, and President Bush has placed more CFR members in government posts than any predecessor. These insiders, along with dozens of CFR members in the House and Senate, plus those in New York who have not taken government posts but who retain great influence over national affairs, are leading this nation into the long-desired, tyrannical New World Order. No American worthy of the name wants a New World Order. The world government sought by the architects of this New World Order would mean an end to a nation we inherited and the destruction of the greatest experiment in human liberty in the history of mankind. World government would also establish socialism in place of the free market system, a certain route to conversion of the nation into another third world dead end. And, even worse, it would mean the tyranny has replaced liberty, a kind of tyranny that has been experienced by countless millions throughout the 20th century. A century of unparalleled barbarism, created, sustained, and favored by the insiders of the most powerful conspiracy in the history of mankind. The insiders have taken us far down the various paths toward their satanically inspired goal, and time is running out if we're to save our nation and ourselves from their designs. Real Americans who love their country and want to remain free don't have to lose this struggle. It can be won if enough seize the opportunity to take the U.S. government away from the insiders and return it to the individuals who believe in national independence and individual liberty, and who are not working to create the New World Order. And there is still time to thwart the plans of the insiders and climb out of the tyrannical straitjacket they have prepared for us. Understanding the domination of the Bush administration by the insiders is an essential beginning step towards achieving victory over the whole rotten cabal. The enemy faced by Americans is a conspiracy, an organized group of insiders seeking tyrannical control over the nation and all nations. Its plan and its agents can be exposed and routed by opposing force firmly rooted in principle and unwaveringly propelled by courage. And the John Birch Society is such a society by enough determined Americans, and this is exactly what is needed to thwart the insiders and keep America free. So again, at the end of the chapter, he invites all to join the John Birch Society, and that concludes part 3 of the George H.W. Bush years. Next, we're going to get into the William J. Clinton years.